Thank you. Thank you and welcome. My name is Bill Crawford, and here today we're going to talk about conflict, resolving conflict, dealing with conflict, moving from chaos to calm. Or, put another way, dealing with difficult people versus them dealing with you. I don't know, anybody ever dealt with any difficult people? They're everywhere, aren't they? It's amazing. I don't know. And have you noticed how chaotic it can be in this sense? So another way we could look at this is dealing with conflict without losing your head. Because I think it's fair to say that when we find ourselves in conflict, we often might lose our head. We'll say something we really didn't mean, we'll do something we wish we didn't do, or we really won't say what needs to be said. So today we're going to look at conflict from three perspectives. Number one, what are the underlying causes of conflict? How can a simple disagreement turn so quickly into what seems like a vicious cycle that almost seems to feed off of itself? Number two, when you find yourself in the middle of a conflict, how can we deal with that person in a way that not only resolves the conflict, but actually taps into their internal motivation to hear what we have to say as valuable? And number three, how can we interact with people more proactively in the beginning to actually diffuse conflict before it starts? Now, I'm going to be talking about difficult people today because I'm going to assume that everybody out here is probably pretty good at dealing with normal people, right? I mean, folks that are willing to sit down with you and have a normal conversation, even when there's a disagreement. If someone's willing to sit down with us, we're probably pretty good at that. It's that difficult person, isn't it? It kind of gets under our skin. So here's what I'd like you to be doing. Start thinking of the adjectives you would use to describe any difficult person you have ever encountered, right? Now, this may not be the adjectives you would actually say to their face, okay? I mean, but way deep down in the pit of your stomach, you know, when you're dealing with this person, think of the adjectives you might be using. If you're like most of us, you think of them as rude, obnoxious, loud, arrogant, demanding, rigid, crazy, and we could probably spend the rest of our time together making this list, couldn't we? So here's what I'd like for you to do. I'd like for you to imagine in your mind that this represents all of the difficult people you've ever encountered. So if you had some adjectives that aren't on this list, just imagine they are, and it will work. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that when we find ourselves dealing with them, we find ourselves sometimes reacting in certain ways. Not so much how we should react, but way deep down in the pit of our stomach, you know, when we're dealing with these rude, obnoxious, loud, arrogant, demanding, rigid, and crazy people. How do we find ourselves reacting? Well, we become defensive, frustrated. Notice how frustrating it is to deal with one of these folks? We sometimes get loud, trying to getting louder than them, or we withdraw. It can be kind of a fight or flight experience. We feel superior sometimes. Don't you know who you're dealing with, you know? Confused, like, why are you treating me this way, you know? And then we get crazy. Now, here's something really, really important. These are the difficult people, and we are the nice people. Now, why would I say that they're the difficult people and we're the nice people when it kind of looks like we're doing the same thing? Because they started it, didn't they? I mean, isn't that true? I mean, remember when you were a little kid and you had a conflict? Well, they did. We were having a perfectly wonderful day. They came into our lives. They did that, and we found ourselves doing that. Which would be bad enough if it stopped there. But have you noticed that it doesn't? Because when they do this and we do that, what do? More, right? Don't you think they become even more rude, obnoxious, loud, arrogant? Which of course has us reacting again. Which of course has them becoming more difficult, and we react and they become more difficult and react and 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 difficult until we create what I call the cycle of conflict. Does this look familiar to anyone here in the room? Yes, absolutely. And I think it's important to recognize how challenging it can be to be caught in that cycle of conflict. I mean, let's think of the problems that might exist if this cycle of conflict became our relationship with that person. Well, obviously, communication would stop, right? And productivity, or if we had to deal with them in any way effectively, they wouldn't be listening to anything we had to say. And if we really needed information from them, they wouldn't be giving it. So that's one of the problems. Second problem is they'll probably go tell somebody. Have you noticed that? Because this is really interesting. Guess who they see as the difficult person? Us, exactly. They see, well, they just got defensive, frustrated, and withdrawal. One of them looked really confused, didn't know what was going on. In other words, they see our reaction to them as us being the difficult person, and they go tell somebody. And you notice how challenging it can be to have someone who is out there spreading negative PR about you or your department or your organization. I mean, it's amazingly problematic. Now, also, I think it's important to recognize is this cycle of conflict can be very stressful, right? This is my second PBS special. The first one was called All Stressed Up and Nowhere to Go. And in speaking to dealing with stress, a lot of people talked about how difficult people really were problematic in their lives and created a lot of stress. I mean, just imagine this. You're sitting in your office or your home or you're being just fine, and all of a sudden this person comes into your life and they're all upset and they're all difficult. You're fine for a while, but all of a sudden you seem to catch it, right? And all of a sudden you're doing this, and they could even leave the room and you're still doing it, you know? And then someone else would come in and say, excuse me. You go, what do you want? In other words, we can take this into our next encounter with our significant other or, you know, our colleague or our coworker. Or again, we save it up and take it home, right? Where we kick the dog or something like that. So we got to do something about this stressful experience here. Matter of fact, there's a really nice quote about how resentment plays a role in this. It says, resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Isn't that true? I mean, they have no clue that it's happening, right? I mean, they're away somewhere, but that poison is actually eating us up inside. So we really got to change this situation. So in changing it, we've got to recognize that if we stay caught in the cycle of conflict, it won't work. Let's look at change for a moment. Here's what I'd like for you to do. Look around you and become part of a pair and have one of you be A and the other B. Figure out who you are, A or B. A's. Could I see all the A's in the room, by the way? A's, 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 A's. Now, A's, here's what I want you to do. Now, don't do it yet, but when I ask you to, A's, I want you to make a fist as tight as you can. Now, don't hit anybody with it, you know. Just make your fist. Okay, B's, could I see your hand? B's, 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 B's. Okay, B's, good. B's, here's what I want you to do, B's. I'm going to give you 20 seconds, B's, to get A to open their fist any way you can. A's, make your fist as tight as you can. B's, you have 20 seconds. Go! That's great. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Y'all are having much too much fun with this exercise, I think. Okay, let me find out how many people actually got your partner to open their fist and the techniques you used. How many actually got your partner? About 10%. Okay, that's pretty normal. Let me find out the techniques you used. How many of you used the tickle technique? Anybody? Yes, tickle technique. That's always a lot of fun. How many of you used the bribe technique? Anybody try the bribe technique? Yes, that's a very popular one. Now, did anybody try the bribe technique and it not work? Okay, great. All right. Now, there's only one reason the bribe technique does not work. Not enough money, right? I mean, pull out $500, that hand's going to fly right open. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should bribe or pay difficult people to be nice to us. I'm just wanting you to know that when you have used the bribe technique successfully, here's what you've actually done. You've tapped into their internal motivation to hear what you have to say as valuable to them. Going to use that later on. File that in the back of your mind. How many of you used the force and pain technique? I saw a lot of that, yeah. That was it. By the way, that is the most popular technique. And let me show you the result of that. Everybody make a fist as tight as you can. Tight, tight, tight. Now, if someone were to come along and actually try to force your fist open, what would your reaction be? Tighter. Ooh. Are you saying that whenever we try to force someone to change, what we're actually doing is motivating them to resist us even more? Ooh. I call this the lesson of the fist. The lesson of the fist may be one of the most important things you're going to hear about dealing with difficult people. The lesson of the fist says that whenever we try to force someone to change, they will either resist us or resent us or both, and as a result become more motivated to defend their position. And I think that is so important to recognize. Now, we got to deal with this situation, but we can't deal with it by trying to change them first. So what do? I suggest we raise our awareness of what's really going on here. There's a great quote that speaks to that. By Albert Einstein, it says, "Problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them." That's important because I think when we're caught in the cycle of conflict, that's what we're trying to do. We're almost trying to solve the problem at the same level of awareness that created them, i.e., we think they made us mad, they think we made them mad, here we go. So what we're going to do is actually raise our awareness of what's really going on here. Now, a lot of people think it is the facts or what happens to us that actually causes our experience of life. I'm going to suggest, however, it's not so much the facts. The facts do play a role. They are actually filtered through our beliefs, and it is our beliefs that create our experience of life. Let me give you an example. You know, a long time ago, most of the people on the planet believed that the world was flat, right? Now, the facts were, of course, the world was round, but everybody believed it was flat. Now, when a ship sailed out and didn't come back, what did they think? Fell off the edge of the earth. You see, our beliefs create our interpretations, or how we give meaning to whatever it is we see. A lot of times our interpretations are much more congruent with our beliefs than they are with the facts. So, they believed the world was flat, ship sailed out too far, must have fallen off the edge of the earth. They would expect, therefore, that if another ship sailed out too far, it too would fall off the edge of the earth, right? Our beliefs and interpretations create our expectations, what we expect to happen next. Based on this expectation that a ship was going to fall off the edge of the earth, we would probably be kind of concerned, if not frightened, about getting on ships, right? Our expectations create our emotions, how we feel about things. Based on this fear of getting on ships concerned, what we would do is then we would probably avoid ships. You see, our emotions create our behaviors. And what we would think, because we had avoided ships based on this belief that the world is flat, is that, see, we are safe because we know the world is flat, I'm not getting on a ship, and therefore our behaviors, emotions, expectations, interpretations then go to reinforce our beliefs. So, once we have established how powerful our beliefs are, let's look at what beliefs are underlying the cycle of conflict. Let's look at them first. Now, I think it's important here to recognize we're going to be talking about two types of difficult people. There is the acutely difficult person, and there's the chronically difficult person. Now, the acutely difficult person is probably like us, right? And we've all been there. Something bad happened. We got yelled at. We had a flat tire, and we just kind of snapped at people. We became that acutely difficult person. I don't think that's the real problem in our lives. I think the real problem is the chronically difficult person, right? Who's been this way almost all their life and is pretty much this way to everybody they meet. Let's look at what beliefs might be underlying them if they are a chronically difficult person. For instance, what do you think this person believes about the world in general? Safe or unsafe? Unsafe, yeah. They think people are out to get them, right? Now, what do you think this person believes about the concept of trust and cooperation? Now, this is kind of tricky. What do you think this person believes about themselves? High self-esteem or low self-esteem? Low, exactly. They may act high, but what that is really a sign that they're feeling bad about themselves, low self-esteem. Now, one of the characteristics of low self-esteem, when someone has low self-esteem, they think there's something wrong with them. So this person thinks there's something wrong with them, and guess what? We agree with them, don't we? Tell you, yes sir, there's something wrong with you, which may not be working for us, you see, because if we react to them in a way that reinforces their beliefs about the world, that the world is an unsafe place, that people are out to get them, and that trust and cooperation are dangerous, and that there's something wrong with them, if our behavior, our reaction reinforces those beliefs, we are reinforcing the very behavior we're trying to get them to change. And I think that's what's so important here to recognize. Now, another belief we have that is important to recognize is often we believe that they made me feel this way, right? We'll say, boy, that person made me so angry, right? I think we want to be a little bit careful about holding on to that belief because when we do, we make this person the most important person in our life. On a scale of 1 to 10, to what degree do you want this person running your life? 0. And yet if we define running our life by occupying our thoughts and emotions, to what degree are we allowing them when we react that way? 10. So what we've got to do is recognize that they don't make us feel that way, but that's kind of hard. Let me give you an example here. Let's assume this difficult person is a clerk. Okay, and you're standing in line, you're returning some merchandise, the people in front of you are dealing with this person's being rude, obnoxious, loud, arrogant, and you're watching this and kind of getting angrier and angrier, and you're just about to deal with this person, and someone whispers in your ear, I don't know if you know it or not, but their 1-year-old child was killed in a car wreck a couple of days ago. Oh, do we now feel defensive? No. Frustrated? Loud? No. Withdrawn? Superior? Look at this. We are no longer confused because our beliefs about this person have changed. And based on that, we're now interpreting their behavior differently. We now feel different emotions. How do we feel about them now? Sorry for them, compassionate. What's our behavior likely to be? More tolerant, compassionate. There's a great quote that speaks to how compassion can play a role here. It says, compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. I love that part. Compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Where there is compassion, even the most poisonous impulses remain relatively harmless. So, remember we talked about how problematic resentment can be. It can be a poison, you know. Well, if resentment is the poison, then maybe compassion is the antitoxin. Something to think about. What we want to be very clear, however, is we've got to change this perspective. Okay, let's look at what we've talked about so far. We began talking about the cycle of conflict. How when they are a certain way, we find ourselves reacting a certain way. That makes them worse. We react to that. We create this cycle of conflict, which again seems to feed off of itself. We've also looked at that when we try to change them first, remember the lesson of the fist, they get more resistant. They become more the way we don't want them to be. We also talked about what is really underlying all of this. What's really underlying all of this is beliefs. Their beliefs about the world, they think this is a dangerous place to be. Our beliefs about them. We've also talked about how when we can begin to see them with some sense of compassion, we can begin to change our reaction. Now, I'm not saying that you always have to be compassionate in dealing with difficult people. However, if you're talking about feeling defensive, frustrated, loud, withdrawn, confused, crazy, or compassionate, sometimes compassionate isn't a bad choice. Because remember, one of the things we're wanting to do is not take on their stuff, not match them in the way they're interacting with us so that we get all stressed up and have no place to go. So what we're going to do this section is we're going to look a little bit more specifically at when we find ourselves dealing with one of these difficult people, how can we interact with them in a way that actually taps into their internal motivation to hear what we have to say as valuable. Not only just resolves the conflict, because that's kind of like putting out a fire, you know. And when you put out a fire, you always know there's some smoldering embers underneath there, right? So rather than have us just going around putting out fires, what I'd like to show you how to do is actually change the relationship with that person so they become less of an enemy and more of an ally. How to do that? Well, I think it's important to recognize that there are probably some reasons that at least most difficult people think they have a reason to be difficult with us. And remember that quote from Albert Einstein, problems are not solved at the same level of awareness that created them. So what we want to do is raise our awareness of what is behind their difficult behavior so we can deal with it more effectively. I also think it's really important that we get really clear what we're going for. What's our goal here? And I think it's important to recognize that what we want to do for the most part is communicate with people. We want them to hear what we have to say. We want them to give us the information we need. I'm going to suggest that in order for communication to go forward, two forces must be present, an active and a receptive. Now notice I didn't say active and passive, I said active and receptive. The reason I make that distinction is a lot of us grow up seeing the active perspective as the most powerful one. I mean, just think of being a kid. When your parents were talking to you, for the most part, they were being active, right? And you were supposed to be at least somewhat receptive. So what I think is important to recognize is we have to be careful about going immediately to that active perspective. For instance, let me ask you the question. What do you think these people are going to be, more active or receptive? Active, exactly. They're going to be actively resistant. So if we're active right back, here's what we create, that cycle of conflict. Now let me demonstrate to you how the receptive perspective or the receptive position can be valuable and powerful even. I'm going to ask a friend of mine to come up. Steve Butler. Let's give Steve a hand. Thank you, Steve. Welcome, welcome up. I've asked Steve to come up and help me demonstrate this. Steve, what I'd like for you to do is hit my hand and say, Bill, you're wrong.
Bill, you're wrong.
All right. Now, in our culture, when someone hits you, especially if it's a guy, what are you supposed to do? Hit him back. So I'd go, no, Steve, you're wrong. And you'd go,
no, I think you're wrong.
Oh, I know you're wrong.
No, I'm sorry, you're wrong.
No, you're wrong. So here we go.
Yeah.
We have just created the cycle of conflict. Have you noticed? The more I escalate, the more he escalates, and here we go. Now, I say in our culture, when someone hits you, you're supposed to hit them back. In other cultures, that's not the same thing. In other cultures, the idea is not to get hit in the first place. So, Steve, here's what I'd like you to do. Swing at me slow motion and say, Bill, you're wrong.
Bill, you're wrong.
Okay, look, it took very little energy for me to step aside, okay? Before, I had to meet his energy and try to push him back. And let's assume I could do that. Obviously, I can't, but let's assume that I could beat Steve. Like, I could win by becoming more difficult or more active than he was, and I could bring Steve to his knees. What do you think Steve would be thinking about me at this point? Yeah, not real happy, right? Revenge. I would have just created, feel free to stand up, Steve. I would have just created what I call an ambassador of doom, who is now very motivated to go out and trash me and my department, my organization. We don't want to create this ambassador of doom. Matter of fact, we want them to cooperate with us more. But they're being actively resistant. What do? Try that again. Bill, you're wrong.
Bill, you're wrong.
Now look, he's already moving in this direction. It took very little energy for me to take him, moving him in this direction, and turn the conversation around. Now, here's what I did do, and here's what I didn't do. I didn't take him and throw him across the room, right? I mean, he would have gotten angry. And I didn't even drag him across the room. He was already moving in this direction. I just basically went in the direction he was going and then began to take control of the situation and turn the situation around. Now, here's something really, really important. You can't do this manipulatively, right? Like, now I know how to wrap these difficult people around my finger. I'll get them. Because if a difficult person thinks you're manipulating them, they will resist you, right? They have to believe that you're going in their direction in a way that actually honors what they have to say. And that is really important. Try that again. Bill, you're wrong.
Bill, you're wrong.
All right, he's already going in this direction. Now you give them something they want. Steve, would you like to sit down?
Yes, very much.
Let's give Steve. Absolutely. That is the power of the receptive position. I think it's fair to say, however, that most of us didn't grow up doing it that way. And so what we've got to do is learn how to do it that way. In learning how to do it that way, I think it's important to recognize that there are probably some reasons why people are difficult with us in the first place. And the more that we understand those reasons, the more we can interact with them on purpose. For instance, would it be fair to say that one of the reasons that people are difficult with us is they have a need to tell us something? I mean, you've probably been in this situation, right, where you have a need to tell somebody something and they're not listening. Have you noticed how frustrating that is? And so what do? We get louder and more insistent and more difficult trying to get them to listen to us. Well, it's important to recognize that difficult people do the same thing. So when someone has a need to tell you something, and it's one of the reasons they're being difficult, what I suggest we do is listen. Kind of sounds like a no-brainer, right? But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of times when we listen, we're not really listening, are we? Especially when we're dealing with one of these difficult people, right? We're either going, yeah, give me a break, go ahead. Well, in other words, we're just letting them vent, or we're forming our response to them, right? Well, when they get through, I'm going to hit them with this. Or we're making grocery lists in our mind, or we're doing something other than really listening to them. But remember, if one of the reasons they're being difficult with us is because they have a need to tell us something and we're not really listening, they have to raise the ante. They have to become more difficult in order to get us to pay attention. We don't want to motivate them to become more difficult. So we listen, but we don't just listen to let them vent. We actually listen for what's important to them. Because what's fascinating about when people are venting, what they're actually doing is giving us the key to their cooperation. Because they're telling us what's important to them. We want to be able to draw on that later in the model when it's time for us to offer a solution. So the more we listen for the key to their cooperation, the more we have that valuable information to draw upon later. Also, we want to make sure that they really believe that we've heard what they've said. How could we demonstrate to them that we've actually truly heard what they've said? Paraphrase it back, yes. Now, it's important that we paraphrase it versus just repeat it back word for word, because it has almost become a cliche in our society. In other words, if someone comes up to you and says, "I'm really feeling frustrated and angry," and you say, "I hear you're feeling frustrated and angry," they'll slap you, right? I mean, they don't care about that. That just says, "I heard what you said," but it doesn't say, "I really understood what you said." What you want to do is paraphrase back, because when you paraphrase, you tell them what you understood them to say. Let me make sure I got this right. Here's what I heard you say, or here's what I understood you to say. Then you say it, then you ask, did I get it right? Because whether they say yes or no, it's really valuable information. If they say yes, you know, they now know that they've heard you and you've heard them. And that's now a valuable step in moving forward. If they say no, it means you've missed something. And you want to make sure not to miss something, because remember, that is the key to their cooperation. Now, would it be fair to say that another reason people are difficult with us is because sometimes they're afraid that we don't understand the seriousness of their problem. And most people believe that this problem is serious and they have a right to be upset, right? Fair to say? That's why when we tell them to calm down again, they don't say, "Thank you for sharing." They get more upset because they hear our telling them to calm down as us implying that we don't see their problem as a serious one. So here's where I'm going to encourage you to empathize. Now, I know this sounds like psychobabble, so hold on for a moment. When I say empathize, what I just really mean is you might say something like, "You know, I can understand how you'd be upset by this." That lets them know that you understand the seriousness of their problem. It doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with them. And that's important, because a lot of us have that confused. A lot of us say, "Well, I can't say that I can understand because I don't agree." Well, it's important to make a distinction between understanding what someone says and agreeing with it. A lot of times you won't necessarily agree with their position, but you can understand how they'd be upset. The challenge is to empathize with them so they no longer need to defend their right to be upset or need to defend the seriousness of their problem. Okay. Another reason that people are difficult with us sometimes is they don't believe that we really value their input and their ideas. And they're saying, "Hey, well, if you don't care what I think, why should I care what you think, right?" Here is where you ask them. You basically say, "What are your ideas for solving this? And would you be willing to work with me?" This does two things. Number one, it begins to move the cycle of conflict into the present and into the problem-solving stage. Remember, most conflicts are often about who said what in the past, who did what. That, by the way, is an unwinnable argument. They will remember it one way, you will remember it another way. So when you can say, "What are your ideas about solving this?" you begin to have them generate solutions. Plus, you learn more about their key, because in their solutions, they're going to tell you what's important to them. Plus, you begin to move the whole experience into the problem-solving stage. So let's look at what we've done so far. So far, we have dealt with them by listening, empathizing, and asking, all receptive skills. That's that when I was leading Steve across the stage here, I was taking that receptive position, but in the meantime, I was learning more about the situation so that I can then move into the active stage. It is important that you do move into the active stage, because if all you do is listen, empathize, and ask, they'll think you're not going to address the problem, right? So you do move into the problem-solving stage. However, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes they have some fear about that. For instance, they may be afraid that either we're not going to address the problem, or that if we win, they lose. Or if we create the solution, somehow they will not be represented in it. Here is where you take all the information you have gathered in the listening, empathizing, and asking, and you blend that with your ideas so that you begin to move into the problem-solving stage, taking the active role now by blending their ideas with yours. It means you're going to come up with a solution that they're going to be more invested in and more willing to cooperate with you around, because it has some of their ideas in it. Okay. Let's look and see what we've done so far. We've dealt with their fear that they have to tell us something, but we won't listen. We've also dealt with their fear that we don't really understand the seriousness of their problem. We've dealt with the fear that they're afraid that we don't really value their input or their ideas, and that they're afraid that if we win, they lose. We have dealt with all of this by listening, empathizing, asking, and problem solving. The fourth thing we do is problem solving. Now, for many of us, I think it's important to recognize that while this makes sense, it's probably not a real familiar model, right? We didn't grow... Well, let me ask you, when there was a conflict in your family, how many of you had parents that turned to you and the first thing they did was listen and then empathize with you? And this is not a knock against parents, right? I had great parents. They didn't do that either. It's just the important thing to recognize that most of us didn't grow up with this model. So I think it's fair to say that in order to practice this, and by the way, this will take practice, that we may need to take a LEAP, or leap of faith, in order to be willing to practice this. Now, here's what most of us do that doesn't work with difficult people. When people bring us a problem, most of us move into the problem-solving mode. And the problem with that is they're often not ready to hear that solution. So it becomes a PLEA, or a plea for their attention. I'm encouraging you to recognize the value of having problem solving being the very last thing you do. Because at that point, you have actually helped them move to a place where they're more open to hear what you have to say as valuable. Now, there is one other thing you can do when you're dealing with people like this. You can remember one word and change one word, and it will make a huge difference. For instance, most of us have learned that what we can do is we can acknowledge a person's problem. And so we'll say something like, yeah, I see what you have to say, but... That's almost like going up to someone in your family saying, you know, I really love you, but... They're not going to be too open to what you're about to say next. The problem with but is it negates anything that comes in front of it. All you have to do is change that word to and. You know, I really hear what you have to say, and I have some thoughts about that as well. See, now they're going to be more open to hearing what you have to say because you haven't negated their perspective. Also, they're going to be more open to what you have to say because when you're talking about and, you're really drawing from their perspective and your perspective in order to create a solution. You're creating a both and solution versus an either or solution. And remember, they're going to be more motivated to go along with you in that particular situation. Now, there is one other reason that people are difficult with us, and it's one I think may be the most powerful. Sometimes people are afraid we're going to blame or criticize them. Anybody have kids out there, you know? Yes, kids, oh, goodness gracious. And when they think we're going to blame or criticize them, they shut down, right? Here's where, when you're dealing with a difficult person or kids, I would encourage you to adopt a brand new rule. I made this rule up. I call it the you stupid idiot rule. Now, the you stupid idiot rule says you never say anything in any way that you could put you stupid idiot on the end of. Like, no, we can't do it that way. You stupid idiot. Or haven't you read the manual? It's in the manual. You stupid idiot. See, it's my belief that when we say something in a way that you could put you stupid idiot on the end of, they will put it on there whether we say it or not. And they will react to us just as if we've called them you stupid idiot, which means they will become more defensive. So here's where I encourage you to actually change the leap model into the leaps model by speaking in a way that doesn't put them on the defensive or remembering the you stupid idiot rule. And again, what that does is change the leap model into the leaps model and becomes more of a complete model. Let's look at what we've talked about so far. We've actually begun to understand the cycle of conflict, that it is created by us reacting to them reacting to us, and that if we try to solve the problem from within that cycle, i.e., if we try to change them first, they become more resistant. Remember the lesson of the fist. It speaks to as we try to change them first, they don't change, they become more the way we don't want them to be. What we've also talked about is how we can look at the beliefs that are underlying the cycle of conflict, how they believe about the world, what we believe about ourselves and them. In doing so, we can understand those beliefs. Remember that quote from Albert Einstein, problems are not solved at the same level of awareness that created them. And so we can raise our level of awareness of the beliefs that are actually behind and underneath the cycle of conflict, which means we can become more influential, more powerful in dealing with people in general. We've also talked about that there's probably some reasons that people are difficult with us, or at least they think there's reasons for them to be difficult with us. They have a need to tell us something, all of those. We've recognized that by listening to them, empathizing, and then asking, using the receptive position first, those being receptive skills, we can then begin moving into the problem-solving position in a little more effective way. We've also recognized that as we speak to them in a way that doesn't blame or criticize them, remembering the "you stupid idiot" rule, that what we can do is have, again, them become more motivated to hear what we have to say as valuable. All right, now we're going to go for the gold here. We're going to find out how can we interact with people that stops conflict before it starts. How can we create our relationships, our interactions with people in such a way they are primed to hear what we have to say is valuable in the very beginning, and we don't have to get into a cycle of conflict and somehow find a way to end it or stop it. Well, I'm going to suggest that just as we talked about in the second section, we be very, very clear about what is our purpose. And again, I think the more we are clear about our purpose, the more valuable we can be. I'm going to suggest that our purpose is not only what we want to create, the impact we want to have on them, but it's our vision of how we would be thinking, feeling, and acting if you were responding to them on purpose. See, I don't think we do this on purpose. I don't think we say, I know when I'm dealing with a rude, obnoxious, arrogant person, I'm going to get defensive, frustrated, and loud. Yeah, that's a good idea. We just find ourselves reacting to that. So what's important here is if we're not doing this on purpose, the more we can be more purposeful, on purpose, more deliberate in our interactions with people, the more we can be successful. Now, the best way of doing that is have some image in our mind of the qualities, the ways we would be thinking, feeling, and acting, the behaviors we would like to display if we were interacting with these people on purpose. Because the more we have clear in our mind about these abilities, the more we're going to be able to draw upon them in any kind of situation, even if it does turn into a conflict. Makes sense, right? I mean, yeah. Have you noticed? We don't do it. I mean, very few people say, wow, this is a brand new situation. I've never done this before, right? I mean, it's a pretty common. I think the reason that we find ourselves falling into the cycle of conflict is what I call our past. And when I say our past, I mean our habits, beliefs, old ways of thinking, learned perspectives that may not be congruent with our purpose. And I think it's important that we raise our awareness of what those habits, tendencies are. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not one of these folks in psychology that thinks that all the things you learned in your past is wrong and it's your parents' fault and all that kind of stuff. I just want us to recognize that we have learned some ways of responding in our past. And those ways of responding may be based on old beliefs. Remember, we talked about the power of these beliefs. Just think of how you grew up in your family and think of how your family dealt or deals with conflict. See, those became then our beliefs about conflict, and we are having a tendency to bring those beliefs into our experience of dealing with people now. Now again, not all the things you learned are wrong. You may have learned some wonderful things about dealing with people from your past. There may be some beliefs that you really want to hang on to. What I'm encouraging you to do is make sure that whatever aspects of your past you're bringing forward are those that are congruent with your purpose. Now, I really like that question because we don't have to ask ourselves, is this right or wrong or good or bad or should I or shouldn't I? The question only becomes, is what I'm doing or what I'm about to do congruent with my purpose? Is it congruent with what the impact I want to have on this experience? And is it congruent with the concepts, the ways of being, the characteristics I want to bring to this interaction? Because I have a belief that the more we are clear about our purpose, the impact we want to have, plus the qualities we want to bring to this experience, the clearer we are about that, the clearer we can be in terms of making the impact, and the clearer then we can also be in terms of choosing which habits, which ones we bring, which ones we don't. Now, a lot of people call our past our comfort zone. I think it's important to recognize that sometimes that comfort zone isn't all that comfortable. For instance, have you ever noticed what it's like being in the middle of this cycle of conflict? It's not all that comfortable, is it? And yet we find ourselves doing it again and again. There's a great quote, I think, that speaks to this that says, sometimes we stay in hell a long time because we've learned the names of the streets. Which means sometimes we stay in this cycle of conflict not because we think it's a good idea, but just because we've learned how to get around in that. So it's not so much our comfort zone. What it really is our known zone, right? It's what's known. Which means anything outside of that, by definition, by the way, is the unknown. And a lot of us are a little reluctant to go into that unknown. That's why I'm encouraging you to look at that LEAP model so that when you recognize it may be a little unknown, a little unfamiliar, it's still something you might want to bring into your life. Now, what I think is important to recognize here is moving in this way, what we have to do is be very clear about the aspects of our past that we want to bring into the experience. The clearer we are about that, the more successful we can be. Now, this, in a sense, is the what. What we want, what we don't want. Our purpose, obviously, is what we want. The old aspects of our past that don't serve us or are incongruent with our purpose is what we don't want. The next 3 steps in the model are really more about the how. How do we make this happen? The next step actually comes from my past. I don't know if I spoke to this in my last PBS special, All Stressed Up and Nowhere to Go. I talked about growing up in an AA home. My dad was a recovering alcoholic. I grew up watching him kind of deal with all the things in AA, and I really feel blessed about that. One of the things I learned about growing up in an AA home is all the things that are written on the walls of an AA meeting. I don't know if you've ever seen the walls of an AA meeting, but there's great stuff. There's let go and let God one day at a time. My favorite, however, became the serenity prayer. That of course says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, that's become a very popular prayer. You can now get that prayer on a refrigerator magnet, which means you have made it in our culture if you can get what you believe on a refrigerator magnet. But I think sometimes we think of that prayer like this. Okay, if I have to accept what I can't change, okay, I'll accept what I can't change. I guess I'll change what I can, and then I get serenity. See anything wrong with that interpretation? See, it's backwards. It's not called the get it all done prayer or the make people be how you want them to be prayer. It's called the serenity prayer. And what if it's called the serenity prayer on purpose? What if the prayer actually defines a process by how all this works? I mean, let's look at it. God, grant me the serenity so that I might first accept the things I cannot change. Haven't we really discovered that in dealing with conflict or difficult people, we have to accept that we can't change them first? We have to have the courage to change the things we can, i.e. our response, which then gives us an opportunity to have some influence over the situation. But if we start by trying to change them, they become more resistant. So in order to interact with people in a way that stops conflict before it starts, to be more purposeful, we have to recognize that we can't change them first. I call this 3rd step in the model the wisdom of serenity. Stephen Covey talks about it a little bit in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He talks about pushing the pause button. And I think that's so important to recognize, that in dealing with difficult people, whether we find ourselves in a conflict or not, if we can push that pause button and then choose our next response, bring in serenity, or at least a moment of serenity, so that we can get very clear, what is my purpose here? What do I want to create here? What is the impact I want to have on this experience? And if I were interacting with this person on purpose, what would it look like? Because the more we are clear about that, the better. And what past habits do I know of that if I'm not careful about, I'll have a tendency to fall into? I don't want to fall into those, so we raise our awareness about that. That's what the wisdom of serenity does. It also ties very nicely to the concept of the receptive position. Remember, when you're dealing with a difficult person, you start by taking a receptive position. Having the serenity to accept the things you can't change. You can't change the fact that they are angry right now, so you go with that and then you begin to work with them from that position, the wisdom of serenity. Now, the next step in the model is a little abstract, so hang in here for a moment. It's about choosing the energy that you want to guide your behaviors, your decisions, your interactions, choosing an energy that is congruent with your purpose. I say that because I believe that what is underneath the cycle of conflict for the most part is fear. Let's look at their reaction, why they are being difficult with us in the first place. They have a need to tell us something. They're afraid we won't listen. They're afraid we don't understand the seriousness of their problem or that they have a right to be upset. They're afraid that we don't value their input or ideas. They're afraid that if we win, they lose. They're afraid that we're going to blame and criticize them. Notice, they're afraid is the beginning of almost each one of these. Which means whenever you can say they're afraid, you're talking about someone who is frightened. Now, I find that when you're dealing with people, especially difficult people, and you can see them as frightened versus frightening, or threatened versus threatening, you can then choose your reaction to them. And I think it's easy to see how fear underlies their reaction. Let's look and see how it may underlie our reaction. I mean, wouldn't it be fair to say that we get defensive, frustrated, loud, feel superior, confused because we're afraid that fill in the blank. We're afraid something bad's going to happen. We're afraid they won't listen to us. We're afraid they don't respect us. We're afraid they don't like us. We're afraid they'll tell on. I mean, whatever it is, you could also use that phrase, we're afraid, which also speaks to the fear underlying our response. I'm not saying you're bad for being afraid or you shouldn't be afraid. It's just that raising that level of awareness of the energy that is underlying the cycle of conflict and the problem. Now, this is kind of interesting. It ties into the first PBS special I did called All Stressed Up and Nowhere to Go. It talks about how stress also can be a component and how that really interacts with our fears and worries. Let's look at that. This says, stress is an indicator of our belief in the value and validity of our worries and fears. Stress is an indicator of our belief in the value and validity of our worries and fears. In other words, to the degree that we hold on to our fears about other people and how they're going to be as valuable and valid, to that degree we will experience stress. And as such, stress can be a valuable indicator that we may be holding on to beliefs that don't serve us. So what I'm encouraging you to do to choose an energy very purposefully. Some people call this energy awareness. Other people call this energy compassion. Some people call this energy love. Now, I'm not saying you need to love all the difficult people in the world. I'm just saying that if we do not deal with them purposely, we will find ourselves dealing with them out of fear, and fear is not the energy you want to use. All right, the last step in the model is around responsibility. And a long time ago, this used to be a dirty word for me because I was an only child. My mom and dad had been married 25 years before I was born, and I was their only child. I came along. Mom was, yes, people go, that explains a lot, I can understand. Mom went to the doctor when she was 45 and said, Doc, I'm sick. And he said, no, you're pregnant. She went, stress. So growing up as an only child, I didn't have anybody to blame anything on. If anything went wrong, it was my fault. I couldn't blame it on anybody. And I would make a mess in my room because that was my job, and I did it really well. And my mom and dad would come in and say, who's responsible for this mess? And I'd go, I don't know, not me. It was the monsters. They came in. I tried to stop them, but, you know. I didn't want to be responsible because that meant responsibility. Oh, it was my fault if it went wrong. Matter of fact, I started my career as a musician. And when someone would come up and complain about the band, I'd go, dip, I'm just a drummer. I don't make these high-level corporate decisions. Don't talk to me, not my fault, you know. In other words, I used to deal with responsibility by abdicating it, giving it away to somebody else. However, I noticed that the more I gave that responsibility away, the more power they had in my life. And I wanted to take that back and to be more influential in how I interacted with people. So I had to change the meaning of the word responsibility. I saw this somewhere that responsibility can mean our ability to respond. Responsibility, our ability to respond. And I think that's something that we all know that we do want. We do want the ability to respond to people in a purposeful way, in a way that doesn't fuel the cycle of conflict. I'm going to encourage you that if you do want that ability, to take 100% responsibility for your ability to respond. Because to the degree that you give that percentage, well, I'll meet you halfway, well, what you're doing is leaving about 50% out of there that somebody else is going to influence. So if you really want to be influential, powerful in your interactions with others, I would encourage you to take 100% responsibility for your ability to respond. Okay, let's see if we can begin in the beginning, make sure that we've tied all this together. We began looking at the cycle of conflict, what it's all about. How in many ways it is a cycle that feeds off of itself. They see us as the difficult person, we see them as the difficult person, they're trying to change us, we're trying to change them, we get in that struggle. We've also seen that the more we try to change them, the worse they get, the tighter their fists get, the lesson of the fist. We've recognized that the reason that this is problematic is because what is underneath this are beliefs, their beliefs about the world. Remember, especially the chronically difficult person, they believe the world is a dangerous place, and they believe that people are out to get them. They don't trust, and therefore they're interacting with you as if you're trying to get them. When you interact with them in a way that reinforces those beliefs, you reinforce the very behavior you're trying to change. Also, what's important to recognize about the beliefs is that we have some beliefs about them. When we think that they made me feel this way, and we blame them for our reaction, we have just made that person the most important person in our life because we have just given them the power to make us feel a way we don't want to feel. And remember, this is about moving from chaos to calm, having the power to deal with difficult people and/or conflict versus them dealing with you. We've also talked about when we're dealing with one of these folks, how can we interact with them in a way that actually begins to deal with some of the reasons they are difficult with us. When they're afraid that we won't listen, but we listen for their key. Not just listen for them to vent, listen for their key in a way that we could actually paraphrase back. We then empathize with them, which doesn't necessarily mean we agree with them. Just says it's something like, I can understand how you'd see it that way. Big difference between that and agreeing with someone. We ask them, what are your ideas about solving this? Because if they're afraid that we don't value their perspective and therefore they're not going to value ours until we value theirs, asking them allows them to hear us valuing their perspective. Plus, they tell us what's important to them. We learn more about their key. And believe it or not, sometimes these folks can actually have a good idea about how to solve the problem. I know it's a crazy, wacko thought, but they could actually be very helpful. So asking them what are your ideas helps us then move into the problem-solving mode where we're now blending their ideas with ours. We are now doing that in a way where we remember the you stupid idiot rule, and we are doing that in a way that talks about what we want. Again, the beliefs are so important to keep in mind because these beliefs are what exactly are driving the experience. The LEAP model is also very important to keep in mind because you want to make sure you're practicing this. This will take practice. We also talked about dealing with people on purpose, being very clear about what that purpose is, knowing what aspects of our past serve us, which ones we want to let go of, using the wisdom of serenity as a pause button every once in a while to then choose our purpose, choosing the energy, something other than fear, awareness, compassion, whatever you want to find, and being willing to take 100% responsibility for this process. I believe that when we do this, we become more powerful in our lives. That's why I like to call this model the power model, P-O-W-E-R. It's about us becoming more powerful in our ability to deal with people in a way that not only solves the problem, but can begin to stop it before it starts. So what we've talked about today is having the power to deal with conflict without losing your head. Having the power to deal with difficult people versus them dealing with you. Having the power to move from chaos to calm. I hope you found this to be valuable. You have been a great group. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.